All right, welcome to part two of our review. And we stopped at 39 in the last one because this one went into court decisions. We're actually going to do court decisions separately, but this only has a couple in here, so we're just going to go through John Marshall's Supreme Court decisions. John Marshall was the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Marshall's decisions strengthened the power of the federal government. Okay, so the first one is Marbury versus Madison. Established the power of judicial review, which allowed the Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution. And the second one here is McCulloch versus Maryland, which established the National Bank. Okay, so another one you've been hearing about since second grade, Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson was a Democrat Republican and believed in states' rights and interpreted the Constitution strictly. He did not want the federal government to take on more power than specifically given to it by the Constitution. Jefferson had to contradict his strict constructionist ideas in order to purchase Louisiana. The Louisiana Purchase gave the U.S. control of the Mississippi River. Remember, Louisiana Purchase, he really, really, really wanted the port of New Orleans, right? Because we ended at the Mississippi River. Now, he gave us all these millions and millions of acres of land that had to be explored, and we didn't know what was out there. But it was like, hey, Napoleon, thanks for the deal, right? But he had to go against his own beliefs in order to do that because he didn't get any approval for it. All right, expansion of the U.S., roads, canals, and railroads. Turnpikes or roads were built first. Then came canals, like the Erie Canal, all the way through New York, right? Very good for trade, good for population expansion. The Erie Canal connected the Great Lakes to New York City. Part of it is still around, especially in Lockport. You can go to the Erie Canal locks, okay? Railroads were constructed throughout the mid-1800s, with the first transcontinental railroad completed in 1862. The Monroe Doctrine. President James Monroe's doctrine warned European powers about future colonization in the Western Hemisphere. It said that the U.S. would stay out of European affairs. It was designed to help preserve the independence won by several Latin American countries. It subtly threatened U.S. military intervention if Europe tried to colonize the Western Hemisphere, though we did not have to enforce it for many years. Okay? Well, it just says years, but many years. Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears, something else you've been hearing about for a very long time. Trail of Tears. The Supreme Court ruled in Worcester versus Georgia. This looks like Worcester versus Georgia, that the Cherokee Indians could not be forced to give up their land. Andrew Jackson did not enforce the Supreme Court decision, but instead supported the Indian Removal Act and forcibly removed the Cherokee Indians to west of the Mississippi River. The move was called the Trail of Tears. Okay, I'm sure you've heard about that. I know you learned about it in 7th grade because I taught it. Yeah, it's called the Trail of Tears because thousands of people died. They made them walk. There were old people, there were sick people. They died, they left them. Okay, called the Trail of Tears. Moving on. Manifest Destiny, our destiny. The belief that God planned for the United States to spread from sea to shining sea. The Mexican-American War you might need to know about. A dispute over the border of Texas and Mexico led to the Mexican-American War in 1848. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo gave the U.S. the land known as the Mexican Cession and set off another wave of arguments over the expansion of slavery. Fun. Do we allow these other states, these new states, to have slavery? The gold rush. Many Americans went out west in search of gold in 1848. It led to population growth in the West, especially California. Oh, I'll take that out of there. We could have gone even farther, but I didn't want to go past 20, whatever we had, 23 minutes for the first one. All right, so the expansion of slavery, the Missouri Compromise of 1820. It was written by Henry Clay. Missouri Compromise. Oh, yeah, the 3630 line. Okay. See 3630, think Missouri Compromise. Missouri joined the Union as a slave state, and Maine joined the Union as a free state. North of 36 degrees 30 minutes, 3630, there would be no slavery. It solved the slavery problem for another 20 years. Then we had to fight about it. All right. I think we already had written by Henry Clay, did we not? Well, I'm going to take that out of there too. Sorry about that. California came in as a free state. New Mexico and Utah territories would be decided by popular sovereignty, however they wanted to decide. And then the Fugitive Slave Law was enacted, in which Northerners were supposed to send escaped slaves back south. Actually, the Fugitive Slave Law, that's not as simple as that. I'm not going to go too much into it, but they had people who were getting paid to capture escaped slaves, quote unquote, so they would get a hold of free men and that happened to be African American and shipped them down south. Have you ever seen 13 Years a Slave? That's exactly the story. Okay? No slave trade was allowed in Washington, D.C. The expansion of slavery with the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854. Kansas and Nebraska would determine their slave status based on popular sovereignty. This set off Bleeding Kansas, in which pro- and anti-slavery forces in Kansas clashed. Several people died, and election results were difficult to determine. Bleeding Kansas. Slavery, fighting, didn't know if they wanted to be a slave or a free state. Abolitionists. Abolitionists were people who were against slavery. Okay? Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote the book Uncle Tom's Cabin. Frederick Douglass, that's missing an S, Douglass, from Rochester, New York, wrote an autobiography and published the newspaper, The North Star. The North Star was a way for slaves to find their way when they were running at night from slave states. Okay. Underground Railroad, right? All right. William Lloyd Garrison published The Liberator, and Harriet Tubman helped slaves escape along the Underground Railroad. Remember, the Underground Railroad is not actually a railroad. There were no tracks, there were no cars. It was simply a train of people who were making their way over and over again up to the north, sometimes all the way to Canada from the slave states. Okay? Harriet Tubman is the most famous of the conductors on the Underground Railroad. She made the trip many, many times and helped many people get back and forth, or get to free states. How about that? They actually came right through, I don't know if you guys know Lewiston. It's a little town past Niagara Falls. That's where Miss Morton grew up. And there is the house with the 7 cellars that goes all the way down to the water line of the Niagara River. And that's where people crossed over into Canada. Moving on. The Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott sued, stating that since he had been brought to free territory, he was in fact free. Roger Taney, who is the Chief Justice, and the Supreme Court ruled that Dred Scott was not a citizen and therefore had no right to sue. Taney said that slaves are property and can be taken anywhere. Dred Scott decision therefore negated any of the earlier compromises. So Dred Scott was a slave for, I believe he was a doctor. He was brought to a free state. He said, hey, I'm in a free state. I must be free. sued about it, and they said, no, you're still property. Yeah. Moving on. Election of 1860, Republican Abraham Lincoln won the presidency with the most number of electoral votes, though it was not a majority of the country. The Democrats split their votes to two candidates. Immediately following the election, many southern states seceded or left the Union. Said, yep, we want to keep our slaves, so we're out of here. The Homestead Act in 1862, the federal government planned to give homesteads to any people that would work the land for 5 years. It encouraged settlement of the Great Plains. Okay, federal government, homesteads, working the land for 5 years, settlement of the Great Plains. Sometimes you'll see a document pop up that says Nebraska, 5 acres of land or whatever, and those have to do with the Homestead Act. Okay, trying to encourage people to move out there and work the land. Reconstruction plans, Lincoln and Johnson's. They believed that southern states never left the Union. 10% of voters needed to take an oath of loyalty. States must abolish slavery in their new constitutions. The Reconstruction plans after the Civil War. We're going to go through the Civil War a little bit later. Okay? The Reconstruction came after the Civil War. Radical Republicans. The South divided into 5 military districts. New state constitutions had to be written. Blacks had to be given the right to vote. State must ratify the 14th Amendment. And former Southern Confederate leaders were barred from office and voting. The impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was a Southerner so Northern radical Republicans didn't like him. Radical Republicans passed the Tenure of Office Act, making it illegal for a president to fire someone without the approval of Congress. Johnson fired Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Johnson was brought up on impeachment charges for violating the Tenure of Office Act, and he was impeached but not removed. All right, so now we're post-Civil War, black codes and Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow was not really a person. It was a caricature. Okay? Black codes and Jim Crow laws were passed in many local Southern legislatures to restrict the rights of newly freed blacks. Grandfather clauses, literacy tests, and poll taxes prevented blacks from exercising their right to vote. These freed slaves were given the right to vote, and then they started passing these laws within the states, right? Because it was a federal law. Started passing laws in the states going, oh yeah, sure, you can vote if you can read, or if you can pay this poll tax. If you have money to pay this tax, then you can vote. Okay, they're finding ways to get around federal laws. Excuse me. Sharecropping. In order to make a living following the Civil War, blacks became sharecroppers. Sharecroppers worked the land, often of their previous owners, so land they already knew how to work, in exchange for a share of the profits and a place to live. Most of them did not make a very good living, but they were happy because they had a place to live. Probably not what they had in mind when they told the African Americans they were all free. Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. The 14th Amendment made former slaves citizens and entitled to due process. And the 15th Amendment gave blacks the right to vote. 15th Amendment gave all men the right to vote. That's what that should say, and I'm going to change that. It's, universal male suffrage was the 15th Amendment. It was all men. All men. Moving on. Plessy versus Ferguson. This is a big court case. We're going to go over court cases after, so we'll just zip through this. Okay? 1896, Homer Plessy, who was part black, sat on a white railroad car and was arrested. Supreme Court ruled that segregated facilities was legal, provided that it was equal. Okay? Separate but equal wasn't overturned until 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education. Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal. Okay? If you see I've actually seen documents where it shows a cartoon, it's separate but equal, and white car and black car, and the white car is nice and shiny and beautiful, and the car for the black citizens is all broken down and gross. And now it's separate but equal when you see the pictures from the South where they have white drinking fountain and black drinking fountains. Whites only, blacks only. Okay? Usually the one that's for the African Americans is more, run down. It's separate but equal is in quotes for a reason. All right. Separate but equal wasn't overturned until 1954, so 1896 to 1954. Transcontinental Railroad in 1862, the first Transcontinental Railroad met up at Promontory Point, Utah. Government gave land grants and cash to railroad companies to create the railroad. I'm going to go back. I'm sorry, I read that very quickly and then zipped right along. Transcontinental Railroad. First real fastest way to get from one end of the country to the other. We're almost done, guys. Okay, we'll go a few more. Closing of the frontier. 1890 is considered the end of the Indian Wars. The Battle of Wounded Knee. South Dakota was the last big confrontation between the U.S. troops and the Native Americans. Native American population was dramatically reduced because we had guns. U.S. troops had guns. Okay. Dawes Severalty Act, 1881, aimed at Americanizing the Indians, divided reservations into individual plots for people to own. When they Americanized Indians, what they did was they took their children and put them into schools to teach them English. Yeah. 1881. That wasn't just us either. That went up in Canada too. Urbanization. Urban means city, rural means country. During the period of industrialization, many people moved from the country to cities in search of jobs in the cities. That needs to be reworded. You get the point. In search of jobs. Old versus new immigration. Old immigration was from Western Europe. England, Ireland, Germany, okay, Belgium, lots of places, okay? Lots of people came over in search of roads paved with gold, in search of a new life, okay? So new immigrants coming to the U.S. during the period of industrialization from Eastern Europe, from Italy, from Greece, from Asia, okay? New versus old immigration. Nativism. Many Americans resented the immigrants coming and changing the ethnic makeup of the country. Nativism is something that is universal. It has happened lots of times over the years and continues today. Nativists liked native-born white Protestant males. Native-born white Protestant American males, even though they came from other countries and the Native Americans were the first ones here, but who's counting, right? Immigration restrictions, such as the quota system and a resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan, are examples of the rise of nativism, especially in the 1920s. We'll have to change this soon. Immigration restrictions. For most of industrialization, the U.S. allowed anyone who wanted to immigrate to the U.S. to come. We needed the cheap labor. But 1881, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the U.S. started to restrict immigration and stopped allowing any Chinese in. Chinese Exclusion Act is exactly what it sounds like. The 1920s quota system limited the number of people from particular countries that wanted to immigrate. Preference was given to people from Western Europe. Okay. Okay, we're getting into industrialism and into monopolies. Let me see real quick. Yeah, we're going to stop here. New versus old, nativism, immigration restrictions. We're going to say monopolies for next time because that goes along with big business. All right? So we're good. Immigration restrictions, Chinese Exclusion Act, and the 1920s quota system. And we will continue with 69 after.